to hire me in video form at tdd.training, which is where I host my self-paced World's Best Introduction to Test-Driven Development Level 1. And at any point, if you'd like to ask a question, but you don't think you'd like to ask it today, then you're always welcome to go to ask.jbrains.ca and ask me a question, tell me anything you want to tell me. And as long as you're willing to wait indefinitely for an answer, that service is free. And if you need a better service level agreement, then we can talk about how much that costs. So I wanted to start today with a discussion about, really the central topic that goes with this very clickbaity sounding title, which is over-the-top marketing intentionally, is to center around, I think, a rut that I think a lot of programmers find themselves in, where they have a general feeling that evolutionary design and specifically refactoring would be beneficial to them. And yet, for some reason, they don't do it. They don't do it as much as maybe they'd like to. They have feelings like they would say to themselves, I should do more refactoring, or if I'm pairing with them and I encourage them to take smaller steps or to refactor more and rewrite less, they often want to tell me that they already wanted to do that, but for some reason the habit isn't quite fully developed for them yet, or developed enough. And so they don't really feel comfortable really diving in and making refactoring sort of a centerpiece of the way that they design. And so I want to talk a little bit today about maybe why that happens and what you might be able to do about it. Now, as Amitai pointed out, and as we have been talking about virtually nonstop for 10 months now, the world has changed. And for many, that has resulted in an unusual, well, for some that has resulted in an unusual opportunity to practice refactoring, because people suddenly find themselves, maybe not so suddenly now, they have been growing used to having more autonomy because they're away from prying eyes. They don't have to worry so much about performing for people who might be watching. They don't have to worry so much about FaceTime and all those other kinds of factors that affect how they perform, because they don't have to worry as much about being seen performing in a socially acceptable way. We're away from the spotlight, so we can be a little more iconoclastic, and we can do what we want, as long as we can produce better results. So this has definitely been a good time to try the kinds of things that probably would have helped you in your job if you could have just been given the chance to do it away from prying eyes for 3 months. People wouldn't realize that, in fact, you were not doing acceptable things, but still producing great results. And so perhaps the cost of failure in trying to experiment with how we work has never been lower for some of us. And so this has become a really good opportunity to practice deliberately. And if you have, so I've spent the last 4 or 5 years really focusing on my bowling performance. I am, by the strictest definition, a professional bowler, 5-pin bowler, which is a version of bowling that is only played in Canada. And I'm a medium-sized fish in a fairly small pond. And I've been trying over the last 5 years to sort of move from the sort of tier 2, tier 3 level performer up to the real elite. And so I read a bunch of stuff about coaching and skill development and practice, and a lot about myelin formation, and this notion of deliberate practice has become more interesting to me over that time. And of course, as I was reading this stuff in books like The Talent Code and Talent is Overrated, I started to see immediately how we could use these ideas in software development. And so you probably have never had a better, well, not you probably, many of you have never had a better opportunity than these last 6 to 8 months to take a more deliberate approach to practice, to focus on technique, to give yourself an opportunity to struggle, to not worry so much about continually showing results, where maybe there's more of an opportunity for you to spend some time away from the spotlight, do some things that you might not want other people to watch you do, as a way of trying to increase your capacity to do better work for other people. And so this deliberate practice is a centerpiece of the so-called 10,000 hours rule, which Malcolm Gladwell, in spite of himself, sort of accidentally mispromoted. It's unfortunate. It's the law of raspberry jam, right? The wider you spread, the thinner it gets. The idea wasn't simply that you do things for 10,000 hours and become a master. It's that around 10,000 hours of deliberate practice tends to correlate highly with a high sense of mastering a skill. And that deliberate practice, it's not just practice makes perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect. Now that makes me nervous. I'd like to say that deliberate practice makes perfect. And I think that's one thing that's missing from evolutionary design skill or evolutionary design practice, that programmers maybe don't have enough of an idea of how to practice it deliberately. I wrote an article years ago called Test-Driven Development as Pragmatic Deliberate Practice. And so some of the things that I'm talking about here are sort of crystallizations of some of those ideas. So this rut that a lot of programmers find themselves in, by the way, I discover this rut often when I work with programmers sort of periodically over a longer period of time, as I've been doing with some folks at Spotify, folks that I would be with right now if we were allowed to travel. And there was one group that I noticed, had bought into the ideas of test-driven development, liked the ideas of refactoring. These are people that by and large I no longer needed to convince of the value of the practices, and yet they didn't really seem from year to year to get much faster. Not that faster is the most important thing, but there's, you would expect that if you do something for a few years that you would get faster at it eventually. And they didn't really seem to be, and we were wondering why that was. And so this is how I noticed some of these ruts. And when I spoke to them, and I have since spoken to other folks about the same thing, these are some of the common causes of finding themselves in a rut where they know they should refactor, but they don't. And because they don't refactor, they don't get better at it. And because they don't get better at it, they don't do it as well as they'd like. And because they don't do it as well as they'd like, they don't do it as often. And this creates a positive feedback loop that keeps people stuck. Actually, it's not a positive feedback loop. It's dynamic equilibrium, I guess. This creates an equilibrium of opposing forces. And so you might identify with some of these statements. It could have to do with not knowing. I'm struggling with this right now in trying to go through the advent of code problems in PureScript, a language I do not know. And I'm just barely literate in statically typed functional programming. So I find myself stuck in I don't know how to refactor this code. Like, I'm not sure what the valid moves are for removing duplication in PureScript in a way that's different from, say, doing it in Java or JavaScript or another language that I know better. And so I find myself actually dealing with this right now, where I seem to be rewriting in relatively small chunks, but I don't feel myself doing that micro-step, nano-step refactoring that I really feel comfortable with in Java. So it could be that you're not sure how to refactor this code. You don't know what the valid refactoring moves are in an unfamiliar programming language or with an unfamiliar set of libraries. And this causes you to go slowly when you try to refactor, but because you feel pressure to produce results, you give up quite quickly on refactoring. And as a result, you never really trust yourself to refactor code. And if you don't trust yourself to refactor code, then you won't refactor it. So not only that, but if you don't learn to trust yourself to refactor code, then it doesn't just stop you from refactoring this code right now and getting the results of refactoring this code, but in a broader picture, it could cause you to remain stuck in living with, you might feel yourself stuck in having to live with the problems in this system's design. You'll never feel like you can rescue any of the legacy code moving around you. You'll always feel like you have to get it right the first time, or at worst the second time, because you will never get a third chance. And if we were really good at doing it right the first time, we wouldn't care about refactoring. We would always do great work and everything would be fine. And part of the reason that we care at all is that we know that refactoring helps take the pressure off us to get it right the first time. We can, as Brian Merrick, famously said, our goal simply is to be less wrong today than we were yesterday. And at the big picture, I wouldn't blame you if you developed a sort of learned helplessness, that I will never get a chance to do good work here because I will never feel comfortable refactoring this system. I will never feel comfortable refactoring code that we write here, which means that all the mistakes that people make, the cutting corners, the rushing, the genuinely not knowing what to do, but feeling like you have to do something, all those mistakes will accumulate. And that essentially you'll never get a chance to get out from under the weight of the cumulative weight of those mistakes. And so this isn't just about, I'll never get a chance to be a better refactorer, but in a large sense, it can lead to a sort of learned helplessness that could really, really affect the way you work. Not just the way you write code, but I mean, it could really affect your relationship with the job of writing software. I would hate to see that happen. And I mean, I see it happen. That's part of the problem, that in the extreme, this is how people really feel. They feel like they're never going to get better at this stuff. And so, well, what can we do? I always like to start with what's missing. And what I think is missing is what psychologists call chunking. So you could go to the Wikipedia page on chunking, the psychology term, and read more about this. But the basic idea of chunking is as you learn something, in the beginning, you have to think about every detail with more or less equal attention. You have to try to pay attention to everything. And because you're trying to pay attention to everything, there's a very limited space of things that you can pay attention to, that you can attend to. And in the beginning, that space is very small. As you attend to those things, some of the things that you do, some of the steps that you take, some of the processes that you use become easier. Not just in the abstract sense of easier, but you do them with less conscious thought. It's a specific kind of easy. They become autonomic, right? That's where you do them without having to put conscious thought on the steps of making it happen. So think about how you are reading the words on this screen right now, if indeed you are. If you go back far enough, you had to work very hard to decipher every symbol one by one. This weird house-looking thing with a beam in the middle, and then this thing with two humps, and the stick with a dot on top, and then this sort of curly thing. There was a time when you didn't know what those symbols meant, and you had to learn them. And you started by learning those symbols one by one, and then you started to notice things like, well, there's this concept of a letter called A, and there are a few different ways to draw A, but they all mean A. And then you would learn things like, well, now A becomes a concept. You can chunk. You don't have to think about the various ways of writing A. You can just get used to you can just think about A as a concept, and that includes all the various ways of drawing A. Well, you can do the same thing to go from A the letter to A the word. You can do the same thing to go from A the letter to ah the sound. And there are a bunch of ways of writing ah, or the sound A, or any of these things. Chunking is the act of practicing something until you do it unconsciously, which frees up your attention to think about bigger things, to notice bigger things, to attend to bigger things. And so chunking is what I think is really missing for these people who are stuck in this refactoring rut, who haven't, as I said, unlocked the awesome power of refactoring. They're so stuck at the level of either nano steps or micro steps that every time they have the idea to refactor something, They have to attend to the individual steps of refactoring. I have to, do this step in my editor. What was the keystroke for inline again? What was the keystroke for extract? All these things. And as a result of needing to attend to those tiny, tiny steps, they don't reach the point where you can do them with less conscious effort. And if you never reach the point where you do them with less conscious effort, then your mind is never free to think about bigger things and to sort of climb the chunking ladder to get to the point where you stop thinking about nanosteps and instead thinking about microsteps. This refactoring is, instead of extracting a method and putting it in that class, I extract the method, then I notice that it's talking to one of its parameters, and I use the move method refactoring to move it into that class, and everything's done for me. And the last step I have to think of is whether I want to make that method public or not. So those 3 nanosteps are part of the microstep of extracting a method to another class. If you still stumble over the nanosteps, then you can't think in terms of the microsteps. But think about what happens when you do. When the nanosteps become easy, then you can think in terms of microsteps. Then the idea of, well, I'll just extract this method into that class becomes a single thing that you think about. And then if you practice those microsteps after a while, then those become moves. And a move is more like, okay, well, I know that here is where I want to introduce a delegate and extract an interface, so that I'll then be able to use test double so that I can write a bunch of tests for this client completely independently from the supplier. What I just said is more at the level of a move. It might require 17 nanosteps in my IDE. It might require 7 commits. I don't know. But I can start to think of those moves as something I might do. Instead of having to worry about focusing on the microsteps or the nanosteps that go into that move. And then gradually I can think about strategies, right? When I work in Java, I refactor, I will tend to do these kinds of refactorings more often, but when I work in Ruby, I have to take smaller steps and do them differently. Or there are certain refactorings that I can feel comfortable doing in Java without tests that I absolutely need tests for when I work in PHP. And my strategy for how to evolve the design is different in both situations. I would never have been able to get to the point of thinking about the difference between how I refactor in Java and how I refactor in PHP if I were still focusing on how do I do inline and how do I do extract. This is what's really missing for most people. So that leads to, I think, a fairly obvious question, which is, okay, well then, how do we chunk? Repetition leads to ease, ease leads to chunking. Chunking happens when you no longer need to attend consciously to every detail of a task. When there are certain parts of the task that you can do without conscious effort, when your fingers know what to do, when, some of you might be old enough to remember the days before everybody had their contact list in a magic box in their pants. And what you used to have to do was remember important phone numbers. I don't know if anybody else had that experience, but I remember remembering important phone numbers. There was, 20, 30 important phone numbers that you remembered because those are the people that you called fairly frequently. And I don't know about you, but the way I remembered phone numbers was physical. It was kinesthetic. I didn't remember the digits. I remembered the pattern of dialing the phone. That's an example of how repetition leads to ease, leads to chunking. And so I didn't have to think about my home phone number, see the digits in my mind and enter them into the phone. I could literally go up to a phone, close my eyes and do this and dial my home phone number. That's an example of how repetition leads to ease and ease leads to chunking. Now, when I think about phoning home, I don't have to worry about how am I going to phone home. I just need to find a phone and then I can do it. And so repetition leads to ease leads to chunking. And as you chunk, this frees your mind to think at a higher level of abstraction. And you can just keep doing this more or less forever. Now, if you've read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, then you're familiar with the metaphor of system 1, system 2, or the labeling of system 1, system 2, right? System 1 is the back of your mind. It's working all the time. It has huge bandwidth. It's solving problems right now without conscious thought. and system 2 is at the front of your mind. That's where you have very limited bandwidth, you have very limited short-term memory, and your attention lives in system 2, which has low bandwidth, and system 1 just does stuff without you realizing it. And the only reason why we're not all superhuman is because system 1 doesn't communicate with system 2 very well. When you bolt upright at 4 o'clock in the morning and go, shit, I finally solved the problem, that's system 1 eventually accidentally somehow communicating to system 2. That's what happens when you have a good idea in the shower, when going for a walk helps you understand why you kept making that mistake. When you chunk, system 2 is essentially taking something that you've learned and understood and handing it off to system 1 and saying, it's your problem now, you deal with it. And system 1 can then operate your fingers in a way that allows you to know which buttons to press and which refactorings, which nanosteps go in the next step, how to move around your IDE, which magic string of Vim keystrokes results in moving the code around in a way that you want. And chunking is essentially repeatedly taking something that used to require conscious thought in system 2 and handing it off to system 1, and then you own it more or less forever. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's good enough for now. What's interesting is that there doesn't really seem to be a limit as to how often we can move things from system 2 to system 1. The limit seems to be in how well we can recall things from system 1. We can't seem to do it on demand. The thing that people call insight or inspiration is another, or intuition. Intuition you can think of as system 1 haphazardly communicating with system 2 so that you can understand how to solve the problem even before you totally understand why it's going to work. So how does chunking happen in refactoring? So I've identified a handful of levels, let's say, of abstraction that everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, that I think I go through, where we have a level of nanosteps, a level of microsteps, a level of moves, and a level of strategies. You can see some examples of them there on the screen. And I don't want to give you the picture that everyone goes through an orderly progression from one level to another. It's more like you have a constant influx of nanosteps that you practice. And as those nanosteps become clear and obvious and easy and autonomic, as you move them back to system 1, you sort of progress down the chart from the nanosteps to the microsteps to moves to strategies. And when you find yourself in an unfamiliar environment, your mind tends to rise back to the top. And nanosteps that maybe are easy to do in Java are uncomfortable to do in PureScript because you're just not used to the different nanosteps. Even the same nanosteps, if there are some nanosteps that are the same in Java as they are in PureScript, that doesn't mean that you know the syntax of PureScript well enough to know how to move the code around. And so as you move into unfamiliar environments, as you feel stress, and as you deal with new problems, your mind tends to retreat back to the smallest levels of abstraction, and then repetition leads to ease, ease leads to chunking, and you can move up the chain again. And as you are learning new things, you learn new nanosteps, and eventually you can integrate them into new microsteps, new moves, new strategies, and then you just gather them like so many berries off bushes for the rest of your life. And what we call refactoring skill is essentially the set of strategies and moves, and maybe to a lesser extent microsteps, that you own as it's related to refactoring. And the real power comes when you can think directly in terms of strategies and moves and feel utterly confident that when it comes time to perform the microsteps and the nanosteps, you'll be able to do them accurately, relatively quickly, and easily. So an example of how you can practice is something like replacing a single item parameter with a collection parameter. And with your indulgence, let's see if we can actually do this. Let me see here. Yes. Let me go here, and I believe I want to go here. Ah, there we are. Excellent. Idea says hi. The basic idea of this, so I just want to show you this real quick. The basic idea is to sit and practice. So here's a really simple thing that you can practice. Take some code, any code, it doesn't matter what code it is because you're going to throw the changes away anyway, and practice something that you feel like you understand, but you don't feel comfortable with yet. So let's imagine, for example, that one of the refactorings that I'm used to is, or that I'm not used to yet, is replacing a thing with a collection of things. And so what I can do is I can just literally set a timer for, I don't know, 10 minutes, grab some code, try to apply the refactoring over and over again with the idea of practicing the nano steps until they feel so comfortable that I notice a difference in how quickly I go and how easy it feels. So let's take this format price function here, which,
JB, can I stop you for a second? We're
sure.
not seeing your IDE. We're seeing Menti. Still.
Pardon me. There we go. How about
There it
that?
is.
Thank you. I forgot to hit the transition. Sorry. Thanks for letting me know. So here we have some code. It doesn't matter what code it is. Like I said, you're going to throw the changes away anyhow. And so let's see how we might try to do this. There are 37,418 ways to do this refactoring as a sequence of nanosteps. It doesn't really matter. What matters is practicing the steps the same way every time so that it starts to feel comfortable. So for example, I like to think of it this way. Let's say I'm going to do this on this format price. It doesn't make any sense to pass in a list of things here, but I'm going to do it that way anyhow. So what I might do to start is, let's try it this way. Let's try starting by changing the signature, and I'll need to do list of integer because Java is annoying. I'm not going to give it a useful name because it doesn't matter. And I want a nice compile error everywhere I might call it. And yeah, I know that's fine. So now I can follow the compile errors and I can try to pass in a value that is logically the same as the current parameter, but in a list instead. So the simplest thing I can do is go in the middle here and just select a bunch of code, copy, go over here, paste, list of that. I can do the same thing down here. This is short enough that I feel comfortable typing. Actually, you know what? Typing it is silly. The simplest thing is to try the same nano steps. Go over here, select it all, copy, go over here, select it all, list of, paste. Excellent. So at this point, I should be happy now that I'm passing in the same value for both the single item and the collection of items, which means that now it's safe for me to turn my attention to the inside here. And my strategy now is to replace this with using the list. The first micro step will be assuming that the list has only one item in it and just using it directly. That's a pretty safe step. So I can just do that until nothing inside this method is using the old parameter anymore. Now the old parameter is not being used. I can do the magic Alt Enter Delete. Everything is cool. Oh, it's warning me. Rerun save delete. Don't worry. You can trust me. I'm a professional. I don't know why it's not wanting to do that. So let's try that one more time. Delete anyway. I pushed the wrong button, so I'm going to have to remember that. This did not work the way I like, so that's interesting. So I'm going to have to be aware of that next time. But now, that seems to be okay. And now what I have is a function that takes a list, but always assumes that there's exactly one item. That seems like a bad idea. But since the code right now only ever passes in one item, this is still safe. Now is a good time where I can do something like this. And of course, I have to remember that Java is silly and forces me to call stream before I can call map. And I'm not entirely sure what the problem is there. Oh, and then I need to actually collect them. So let's collect them, and there. That works for me. So now I realize that one thing I wasn't sure about this nano step is that if I'm going to map this string format over all the items in the list, I have to collect them together somehow. So I guess joining them with the empty string will result in doing whatever it did before. And now I think I'm done. So what I can do with that simple exercise is literally set a timer for 10 minutes and try to do that refactoring over and over again, not until I go faster, but until the steps feel less difficult, less stressful, till they feel easier. That's really what I want. And I can just do that more or less as much as I want, as often as I want. The idea is then to practice the move, and not necessarily to have the goal of it going faster, but to have the goal of it feeling easier. And so maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, take a 5-minute break, come back and do it again. Choose different functions inside the code to do this. And I can do this with any move that I might want to work on. Now, this might feel a bit strange to you, but let me tell you that I have worked with groups who have done this essentially dojo style practice with me, where 3 or 4 of us get together, we grab some code at random. I propose a move like this or a micro step, and they just practice it dojo style. And if they make a mistake, then maybe they will then demonstrate it for the group, and I'll help them do the equivalent of no, put your hand exactly this way, wrist like that, locked. No, don't double tap, just click inside and hit Control W as many times as you need until you select all the code that you need. Don't go over to the front of the code and then swipe over with your trackpad. That way you'll go faster. This is a way to discover nano steps that are going to be helpful, as well as to practice the bigger things. And so you can set a timer, and your goal at the end of when that timer stops, your goal is, like I said, not to go faster, but for it to feel easier. And then you might notice that you go faster as well, and that you also go with fewer mistakes. So if repetition leads to ease, leads to chunking, then chunking leads to confidence, leads to courage. Chunking isn't just an interesting thing that happens, but there's something important that happens when you make chunking a centerpiece of how you learn. If you allow yourself time to chunk as it's related to refactoring, then an interesting thing happens where over time, as you feel more ease in refactoring, you will find yourself resisting refactoring less. You will feel that you'll have instead of having the nagging feeling like you should be refactoring, instead you'll have the impulse to refactor instead of taking something big and throwing it away and writing it again. And as you feel the impulse to refactor more, you'll practice refactoring more, and that creates a positive feedback cycle. Moreover, you'll feel more confident refactoring. You'll try to refactor more. And as you do that, you will start to think of, instead of just thinking about, I want the design to go there, you'll think more about the path of moves or the path of micro steps or the path of nano steps that will get you there. And it might be in the beginning that you have a vague idea of 3 steps that will get you there, but each step feels difficult. Well, then you need to chunk at the level of those steps. You can either do it more often or you can practice deliberately. But the idea is that over time, not only do you feel comfortable getting from here to there in nice orderly steps, but something very important happens that's much more powerful. And that is that you'll feel comfortable starting to take small steps in some direction, even before you know the direction in which you want to go. Many programmers sort of go through this progression where at the beginning, as they're focusing on refactoring correctly, they reach a milestone where I know I want the design to go there, and I now feel comfortable 95% of the time going there in small steps instead of having a vague idea that I want to go there and then sometimes taking small steps, sometimes taking a big leap, and so on. You get to the point where you feel confident most of the time that you can figure out what are the small steps, what are the micro steps, what are the nano steps that get me from A to B. And then after a while, something magic happens. There's some chunking event that happens in the mind that flips this around. And now, instead of having the idea of where to go first and then figuring out how to get there by refactoring, you just start refactoring, and the destination that you need to get to becomes clearer and more in focus over time. And that's where the real power of refactoring, that's where the real power of evolutionary design comes from. Not just in being able to correctly get from here to there, but having the confidence and the courage to just start letting the design evolve even before you know where this part of the design wants to go. But confident that no matter where you end up, it'll end up looking good in retrospect. So you can start practicing this stuff today. There are a bunch of ways to do it, not just the set a timer, deliberate practice idea that I demonstrated, but even simpler things like at the end of every task, set a timer for 30 minutes, set an intention for how you want to refactor the code, and just try refactoring. Maybe there's something specific that you want to improve, or maybe you just want to spend 30 minutes doing some speculative refactoring where you remove duplication and see what new structures might emerge. And the idea here is at the end of 30 minutes, you decide if you want to keep those changes or not. And if you throw those changes away, that's okay, because what you did for 30 minutes was deliberate practice and explore ways in which you might improve the design of this code today. And the worst thing that happens is you figure out that there are certain nano steps that you're not good at yet and you need to practice, or there are certain micro steps that you're not good at yet and you need to practice, or that you actually don't know what direction this code wants to go yet. Fine. If you don't want to spend 30 minutes at the end of every task, then you could try spending 30 minutes once a week. Friday afternoon is refactoring Fridays, so you just do some speculative refactoring for 30 minutes once a week on Friday. Start anywhere. If you want to try to find a part of the code from your day job so that you can improve it, that's great. But you could also do what I did. Just pick some code at random and practice refactoring so that when you are ready to refactor code that needs it, the nano steps and the micro steps will feel more under the fingers and you'll just do them. You won't have to worry about how to do the refactoring. You'll just start. It's really important, I think, and that's stupid. I believe it's important to feel comfortable throwing your work away. You don't need to keep everything you try. And this kind of deliberate practice is also deliberate practice in detaching your ego from your code so that you feel comfortable throwing a change away if it didn't work, so that you can feel comfortable rolling back instead of forcing yourself to roll forward. And this kind of practice shares one important thing with meditation. If you've ever practiced meditation, then you may have heard somebody tell you that as long as you continue, your mind strays from the object of meditation. It might be focusing on your breath. You start to notice that you're lost in thought. You laugh at yourself a little bit. You gently pull your mind back to focusing on the object of meditation. And some people, often you'll have this feeling like, I don't even know if this meditation is helping. I don't know if I'm doing it right. As long as you keep trying, as long as your reaction at the end is simply gently pull your mind back to the object of meditation and start again, as long as you keep doing that, you're doing it correctly. Well, as long as you try to practice in some way, using any of these tricks, that's all that matters. As long as you keep trying to practice, you're doing it correctly. Repetition leads to ease, leads to chunking. Everyone gets there at a different time through a different path. Any opportunity you take to practice is probably helpful. I don't know what the minimum effective dose is. So one of the tricks that I use is start by spending an amount of time. I call it the casino technique. You start by the casino technique. One of them is essentially only gamble with money that you can afford to lose. Well, if you're pretty sure that nobody will yell at you by spending 30 minutes at the end of a task, then start there. And if you do that and a few weeks go by and nobody seems to complain about you slowing down, being less effective, less productive, whatever, then try an hour instead of 30 minutes. And if nobody minds that you spend an hour, if nobody yells at you for not being productive, then try 2 hours. And keep doubling the amount of time that you spend practicing until people start to give you that look from the corner of their, that sort of side eye look that says, hey, you're slowing down. Or if a manager decides to pull you into an unplanned one-on-one meeting, then that might be a sign that you sort of hit the limit. You can do that and then just go back and say, okay, well, I guess 2 hours at the end of every task on average is enough that I can practice and get something out of it, and not so much that it makes people yell at me. Great, I found the equilibrium, let's go there. And these are all different ways that you can practice. I have been, I'm now doing sessions through pubmob.com, where we're doing ensemble programming sessions, 75-minute sessions with up to 6 people. And the series that I'm doing right now is called Evolutionary Design Without Tests, where we focus on the refactoring part and also on trying to write code that is so simple that we have confidence in it even without automated tests. It's kind of an interesting approach. And that is another opportunity for you to just practice the nano steps, the micro steps, with a little bit of pressure because people are watching, but where you care about the result, but you still have the freedom to go at your own speed. Nobody's going to yell at you for going slower. All the pressure that you feel, you'll put on yourself. So start practicing. Why not? You have Slack, so use it. You might not feel like you have Slack. You might not be able to see all the Slack that you have, but I promise you, you probably have spare capacity. You might as well use it for good instead of evil. You might as well use it for yourself. If you invest more of your Slack in yourself, then you will be able to not only gain benefits for yourself, but you'll be able to share those benefits with the rest of the team, the rest of the group, the rest of the company. Keep going and keep investing Slack in your own skill until people start to get angry that you're spending too much time. You'd be surprised at how much excess capacity you have. Most people have never actually tried to figure this out. I recommend it for everyone. You'd be shocked. As an extreme case, when I think about 3 years into my time at IBM, I was literally spending an average of 20 to 25 hours a week while I was at work on the various Yahoo groups, the Refactoring Yahoo group, the Test-Driven Development Yahoo group, the Extreme Programming Yahoo group, the JUnit Yahoo group, where I was able to have discussions about the things that I was doing in my day job with people who had more experience than I did, where I could ask them questions and get suggestions, and that informed my practice. And I wish I could observe how much chunking was going on in my own brain at that time. It was probably dizzying. You never know how much Slack you have until you start looking. And so you can use this Slack to allow yourself the freedom of some repetitive practice so that you can let chunking do its thing. And as I said, chunking eventually leads to courage. And then you'd be amazed within a period of months how much easier you find this work and how much more aggressively you can do your job. And when you can do your job more aggressively, you can deliver better results to all the people around you, and you'll feel better about what you're doing while you're doing it. So whatever it is that still requires your conscious attention, practice there. There's no wrong answer. When you are doing work and you notice something feels difficult, if you notice yourself needing to slow down and be more careful and attend to the details of what you're doing, those are the areas where you have not repeated enough in order for chunking to happen. So be aware of those things. And if you do program with other people, especially if you do it in your day job, whether it's pair programming, ensemble programming, whatever it is, pay attention to where other people slow down and where other people have to sort of pump the brakes and slow down, and invite them to pay attention to when you need to do it and talk about it. Okay, I noticed that you slow down whenever you do this. And they can tell you, I notice you slow down whenever you do this. And those are things that can go in your inbox for practice sessions. And not every practice session has to be exactly the kind of deliberate practice that I'm talking about. But they are the things that you can pay attention to while you are writing code during your 30 minutes of end of task practice on Refactoring Fridays, whenever it is, or if it's in one of these, PubMob sessions, or if you're going to do ensemble programming at a conference, at some point in the future when we get to do that again. Whatever it is that still requires your conscious attention, practice there. And if you do that, then the big things will take care of themselves. And if you're not sure what moves are available to you, ask a friend. Ask someone on Stack Overflow, ask someone on Quora, ask one of us. Go to ask.jbrains.ca. Record yourself with some code and throw it up on YouTube. take some code that you aren't happy with and throw it up in a gist and tweet, hey folks, there's got to be a way to refactor this, but I can't think of it. What would you do? And those are the things that you can then use to help feed your practice. So remember the rewards here: ease and confidence. Refactoring isn't just about producing better results for your employer, although that's true. For me, the real rewards of refactoring are ease and confidence, not just in being able to feel, not just feeling confident that I can get from here to there in a sequence of reversible, safe steps, but that greater confidence where I know I trust my design sense enough that I can just start removing duplication and improving names, and within a couple of hours, I will find some huge design improvement that's going to make life easier for everyone. Every time I sit down at a code base, I have that confidence. Why? 20 years of repetition and ease and chunking. And of course, the more you start to notice that refactoring is no longer a thing that you should do, but instead an interesting problem or an interesting thing, or when you feel like it's getting better, when you feel like it's getting easier, you'll want to do it more, and that's a positive feedback loop that leads to great results. So here are some places where you might start. Read more at my, I have two blogs. The first one is more of the programming design code blog, and the second one is more of the working as a software professional blog. And of course, if you want to try, if you don't do test-driven development or evolutionary design and would like to understand more about how it's done, you can go to tdd.training. The first 35% of that course is available free, and then you can decide whether it's worth paying me some currency units to continue. And that's what I have to say. Again, feel free to reach out. Feel free to ask questions later, if not today. I notice that there are a handful of questions here, so I can try to look at those first, and then we can figure out where we want to go. So let me try. How can one deliberately practice TDD using this principle? So for me, the short version is that I pick, so one easy place to start is to just build a toy project and test drive it as much as you can, and let that be an area where you do nothing but practice. There's no pressure on you to produce results for a paying customer, none of that stuff. That way you can focus on the technique without fear that you're going to cut a corner or decide to take a shortcut in the interest of doing work for a customer. Another way that you can practice is before even going to test-driven development. If you need to build the habit of writing tests, then one of the ways that you can start is to always fix bugs test first. That means that you start whenever you are fixing a bug at work, at your day job, I should say, then start by writing a failing test that fails because of the bug, and then try to use any technique that you know to help narrow the test down to a smaller and smaller test that still fails, so that you can then slowly identify the part of the code that's failing. And then you can decide whether you want to refactor towards a solution, whether you want to just jam the solution in, then refactor what's left over, or whether you want to take this part of the code and test drive a replacement for it. So these are a couple of ways that you can deliberately practice TDD. The important thing for deliberate practice is to allow yourself the freedom to go slowly and attend to all the details and practice doing the same thing the same way over and over again until it feels easy. If you feel pressure to push yourself to go faster, you won't be practicing as deliberately as you need to. You know that practice is deliberate when you feel the freedom to focus on practicing the right steps the same way every time. And instead of trying to make it go faster, try to make it feel easier. Pay attention to how easy it feels. All right. Did I intend to share my ID? I did. So thanks very much for helping me notice that I didn't. On a random piece of code, can we do this with incomplete tests? Absolutely. And in fact, if you're talking about the deliberate refactoring practice, you'll notice that I didn't write any tests. I didn't try to write any tests. Every step that I took, the nano steps, were small enough that they were obviously correct. And the idea is not necessarily, well, I should say, at first, I need to be aware in my mind of what are the steps, right? Add the new parameter, pass the same value twice, once as a single item, once as a list of one item, then go inside the function and stop using the single item, but use the new collection, but just grab the first item. And then instead of assuming that this collection has only one item, loop over the entire collection. The specific nano steps, the specific micro steps might be different for you. They'll be different depending on the language and the IDE. But the goal for me, if I'm practicing a tiny refactoring like that, or even a small refactoring like that, doesn't have to be tiny, I want to do steps that are so small that they're obviously correct. And if I know that there might be a risk, like we saw the problem where when I tried to remove the sense parameter, IDEA didn't do it automatically for me. Being aware that IDEA might not be able to do that correctly and that I might have to patch those by hand, that becomes a thing that I'm aware of when I do those nano steps in that order using IDEA. But that might not be a problem that I have to deal with if I'm doing that refactoring by hand in Ruby. What matters is to find a sequence of nano steps that is where the steps are so small that I don't even need tests to do them correctly. Now, if I'm at the level of practicing a move instead of nano steps, then I might want to have tests there. I might say, okay, well, I know how to do this move and I would never feel comfortable doing this move without tests. But especially at the level of micro steps and nano steps, I want to be able to take steps that are so small that I don't even feel like I need to have tests at all. And so it becomes easier to do that with an incomplete set of tests. And if by chance you meant a different question, then we will get an opportunity to deal with that soon, because those were all the questions that you asked in advance. So that means that I will go back here and I will do this and say, okay, folks, that's all I wanted to show you on the screen. We still have some time left. So if you have any further questions about this or any other topic, then I am happy to try to answer them. So I will pause for a moment and give you a chance. I will, Marcus pointed out that there was a refactoring dialog that we couldn't see. Yes, that's an artifact of sharing the IDEA window instead of sharing my overall screen. If you want to see more, examples of the sort of nano steps of a particular refactoring, go read Martin Fowler's refactoring book. I don't know about the new edition, but certainly the original edition literally showed you the nano steps step by step. That was the last 2/3 of the book, was the catalog of refactorings and all the nano steps, including compile the code now, run the tests now. Here's the next thing. Here's the next thing. Copy the method body into the new place. Compile, run the tests. Make the old method call the new method. Compile, run the tests. That'll give you a place to start, and then you can figure out how to change those nano steps to fit your environment better. In Java, some of those nano steps have been replaced by automated refactorings that you just learn how to use. And now the nano step is remembering that it's Control-Alt-V, Control-Alt-P. Those are the kinds of things that can change. And yes, I'm aware the new refactoring book uses JavaScript examples instead of Java. So it's in the nice thing is that the manual nano steps for refactoring are pretty much the same in both languages. The difference is the amount of automated support that's available in Java for refactoring compared to what's available in JavaScript. Yeah. Oh, we have a recommendation for Duhigg's The Power of Habit. I haven't read The Power of Habit. I have read James Clear's Atomic Habits, and he refers to The Power of Habit as one of his influences. Any of these kinds of habit building approaches I find helpful. And you could think of deliberate practice in this context as a way of building up, not just in the beginning, it's a way of building up a habit of thinking about code changes in terms of refactorings. And then eventually, as I said, the switch flips. And instead of just thinking about, I want to go from here to there as a bunch of safe refactorings, it's, I'm just going to start doing some safe refactorings, and the road will appear in front of me as I walk along. And that way, I don't have to worry about knowing the destination in advance. And after 15 minutes or 30 minutes, I'll go, oh, that's what I want. And then I'll see the picture in my mind of how the design should look. And then I can go back to, all right, from here to there, it's these 27 steps in a row, or even better. I know that these 5 steps will get me to here. And then at that point, I'll remember that these 7 steps will get me to there. And I'll feel confident that I'll be able to get to where I need to go.
I just want to say that you're really good at answering questions before they're asked. So thank you.
No problem. And that's actually one of the reasons why when I, especially when I do a training course, I do, and I forgot to do it here. So what I meant to say 61 minutes ago was it's a good idea for you to have something to write on and something to write with, so that as questions come to your mind, get them out of your head so that you can focus back on what I'm saying. Not because I'm so great, but because there's a very good chance that I'm going to answer your question even before you ask it. And I wouldn't want you to sit there wondering when I'm going to shut up so that you can finally ask your question. I would rather you write that stuff down, get it out of your head, focus on what's happening. And then afterwards, some of you will go to your list of questions and realize, oh, he already answered that. He already answered that. This is the one I need to ask him. So I apologize for not doing that. I hope some of you thought about that anyway. Yes, so we have a comment. So I was just going to say, I haven't seen Sandy's talk called Get a Whiff of This. It sounds interesting, so I will write that down.
Highly recommended.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What would you say is the what's one thing that stood out for you from that talk that that makes you want to recommend it?
Basically, soup to nuts. She groups 23 patterns that are identified, or smells, into 5 groups, and references who originally came up with that grouping. And then proceeds to say, and oh, by the way, there's some wonderful resources like industrial logics, smells to patterns. And there's even some static analyzers that'll tell you what smell you're looking at.
Right. And so this is I don't know, controversial is quite the right word, but often when I do a live training class, people will ask me about sort of having this compendium of classifications of code smells and how to refactor away from them and that kind of thing. Sort of the equivalent of the design patterns book or the analysis patterns book or something like that. And I understand why people ask for it. I get a little bit nervous. And I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that I think Sandy's talk is a bad idea. I think it's helpful for people who are ready to chunk at that level, who are ready to chunk at the level of moves. But I would really worry about somebody who's still struggling with the nano steps, trying to, I mean, that's like, trying to download the encyclopedia into your mind before you've really become fluent in English, right? Or trying to learn a language by downloading a dictionary. Part of the act of struggling with the nano steps and sometimes struggling with the micro steps and sometimes struggling with the moves, chunking isn't something that you can make a shortcut to. Chunking is something that has to happen through repetition and exposure and practice and attention, and not only repetition, but calm repetition, relatively stress-free. You want to have just enough stress where you care about the outcome, but you feel comfortable enough to pay attention to what's going on and to notice what's happening, where you're not just doing a bunch of things to get them done, but you actually still have enough brain power and freedom and comfort, I guess, to think critically about what you're doing. And so somebody watching Sandy's talk, based on what you told me so far, somebody who has spent a lot of time and feels comfortable at sort of the micro step level, that sounds like it's perfect for those people. And for people who are chunking a lot at the move level, but maybe are having a hard time keeping all the moves clear in their mind, they're sort of building up the catalog of good moves and what their effects are. And Sandy's talk sounds like something that, or at least that part of Sandy's talk, sounds like something that could help fast forward chunking at that level. It's a little bit like what happens, one of the legacies of the design patterns movement was that it gave us a vocabulary to be able to talk about design patterns with each other. It's not so much that putting design patterns in my code makes my design better. In fact, often it makes it worse, right? That's one of the jokes at the very beginning of Josh Karyevsky's Refactoring to Patterns book. Here's hello world with 17 patterns. Isn't it beautiful? Reading the design patterns book amounts to reaching the point of chunking enough that you can think of those design patterns as single things, that I can say singleton and you know what I mean. I can say chain of responsibility and you know what I mean. I can say adapter and you know what I mean. The UML diagram in your head and my head is roughly the same. That makes it easier for us to talk about designs at that level of abstraction. That's part of what it was for. Trying to give design patterns to a novice programmer is a chunking mismatch. They might be able to read it and understand it, but they might not be ready for it. They might not benefit from it. And I mean that in a what's appropriate way, not in a parental way. I would never stop anybody from trying to read the design patterns book. But I mean, there are books that I read at the beginning of my career that I had to read again 6 years later and finally started to understand because of the chunking that I'd done in the meantime. So when somebody asks me in a training course, like what are all the important refactorings, or what should I need to learn next? I always struggle to give them an answer, because the act of building up that catalog of micro steps and moves and strategies in your mind is the skill, not just your ability to perform it, but your ability to understand it. And I don't think anyone can upload that into your brain. I don't think you can read it. I think you have to do it. And some reading will help you in what to practice. Now, with this approach, with this talk, part of my goal is to help people feel like they have a strategy for how to build that catalog in their mind, that model of micro steps or moves or strategies that they can believe in, where I'm not just telling them, hey, you just have to practice, but here is what practice will feel like. Here is how you notice you're making progress. Here's what's worth paying attention to. Here's what's not worth paying attention to, and then just let it happen. And I think that seems to help. And I notice that when I allow myself to learn that way, I learn more effectively than trying to push.
I have a question, JB, if you don't mind. I'm surprised. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't mind.
Oh, awesome. So yeah, I'm surprised you actually say that you feel safe making micro steps without any tests around that method. The method you showed was really simple, but most code bases they're not. So what do you think about? I guess I'm surprised by that statement, I guess.
Okay, what surprises you about it?
Because you can trust your IDE to make a refactoring, but there's things that can go wrong, right? So
yeah.
So I prefer to have a test to catch that, but of course then you need more than one test, right? I guess depending on how big the function is. So I guess I don't feel safe unless there's some kind of test higher up somewhere, hopefully around that function. So what do you think about that?
Well, so I think you hit the nail on the head right at the end when you said, I don't feel comfortable without. And that's a statement about your comfort level and not about the practice. And when I mean that, I more mean to say that I'll bet you that with certain amounts of practice in certain ways, in certain areas, as you get to know the tool that you're using more, as you get to know the language you're using more, you might suddenly find yourself comfortable with certain refactorings without tests. I know how you feel because I felt the same way 15, 16 years ago. I think every program, well, maybe not. There's a common pattern I noticed where there's this sort of curve that goes up and then down a little bit. I'll draw that again because I look like I stuttered a bit there. In the beginning, as you learn a technique like, say, programmer testing, right? We write programmer tests because we want a safety net to make it so that we can detect mistakes sooner when we change code. And when I adopted that practice, after I reached the point where I had faith in that practice, I started to do it everywhere all the time. And my goal in doing it everywhere all the time was to get that confidence, was to feel that confidence all the time. I never want to be in a situation without tests because tests give me confidence. They make me feel comfortable. They help me detect problems sooner. And so I'm going to write tests all the time. I'm never going to write code without writing tests first. And I programmed that way for a long time. And then eventually I reached the point where I started to notice that there were certain mistakes that I used to make that I couldn't remember making. Like there were certain kinds of mistakes that, 15 years ago, I would make often enough to remember them. And now 5 years later, 10 years later, 2 years later, I noticed, I haven't made that kind of mistake in a while. Or I'll be in the process of writing a test and I'll look at the test that I've written and say to myself, like, I would have to be drunk off my ass to fail that test. There would have to be a war going on around me to distract me to make a mistake that this test catches. And then I would ask myself the obvious question, well, do I really need this test? Do I really need this test right now in this code base? And so what happens is I started to experiment with not writing tests for those things. And I trusted myself to do that because if I made a mistake and the mistake took me a long time to find, or if I made a mistake, I wouldn't then pop open the debugger and spend 2 hours trying to hunt it down. As soon as I noticed the mistake, I would go undo, write the test. And so what happens is that in the beginning, I was writing tests up front all the time because I loved the security blanket. And then after a while, I started to realize I don't have to write the tests up front all the time if, when I make a mistake, then my immediate impulse is to write more tests, is to write the tests that maybe you could argue I should have written before. And so what's really cool about this is that's the part of the curve where I find a better balance of when I need to write those tests. I write them as soon as I need them, as much as I need them, where I need them. And when I don't need them, I don't write them. Now, that's fine if I'm working alone. If I'm working with other people, then of course, I have to adjust my strategy to match the people around me. I can't optimize for myself, right? But the same is true. If 5 of us working on this code together all have 12 years of experience working in Java, all have 12 years of experience working in these frameworks, have been doing evolutionary design in some way for 12 years, I'll bet you there are some tests that we can trust each other not to write until the bug hits. Because we know that as soon as the bug hits, the first thing we're going to do is write a test, right? First, I'll laugh at Marcus for making that mistake. See, Marcus, I told you we're going to make that mistake. I'll laugh at him for making that mistake, and he'll go, yeah. And then we'll immediately sit down and write a test together. And what that means is that I can feel comfortable refactoring without tests in limited circumstances for specific reasons. Now, the other part of that, which I won't spend nearly as much time saying, is, oh, and by the way, micro committing is the next level of safety net. So even if I'm not writing tests, if I commit frequently enough, then at least when I notice a mistake, it'll be easier for me to pinpoint when the mistake happened using git bisect. And then I only throw away 15 minutes of work instead of 2 days worth of work or an hour's worth of work. So if I know, for example, that I'm going to write fewer tests, then I will probably, they'll probably commit more frequently. And if I notice Marcus is suddenly not writing as many tests as normal, then I'll remind him, hey, shouldn't you commit a little bit more often? And he'll do the same for me. So those are a couple of ways that we can sort of deal with this, you know, how do I feel comfortable doing this without tests? So the last thing I want to say is you should be aware of your own comfort level, and you should write all the tests you need as much as you need, as often as you need, to feel as comfortable as you need. If you have the impulse to write more tests when you feel less comfortable, that's probably all that matters. And this PubMob sessions that we're doing, one of the things that I want to do here is specifically to explore our own feelings about our confidence level related to changing code without tests. Where do we really need those tests? Where do we not? You know, we have really good, I have the theory, the hypothesis that writing tests first for a long time helped me ingrain a lot of really good design habits, a lot of really good safety habits, that maybe I don't need the tests anymore. The tests weren't the cause of the good work. The tests were the trigger to practice the good work. The tests reminded me to work in micro steps, but the micro steps were really what mattered. And maybe I don't need the tests for all those micro steps. And I'm going to need a different set of tests from you. You should do what makes you feel comfortable. And if you're at this part of the curve where you want to write tests all the time because you love the security blanket, do it. Enjoy it. It's great. And eventually, you're going to have that feeling like, I don't think this test could ever reasonably fail. I don't think we need this test. And then the question is, do you have the courage to not write the tests? Maybe. It's something worth practice. Maybe that's the thing you practice for 30 minutes on Friday afternoon, is try fixing a bug without writing any tests. Just the one end-to-end test that shows that the bug is there, but you're not going to write any micro tests and see what happens. And you'd be surprised. Not that writing tests is a bad idea, but that maybe your judgment about when you need tests is more fully developed than you thought it was. Maybe it's time to learn to trust that.
Okay.
All right. Let's see here. Let me just see here. I like this comment from Emily saying that she was worried about how much she was going to understand because she expected the content to be more about, I guess, the details of how to refactor. The details of how to refactor is the easy part, really. I mean, that's just, you read Martin Fowler's refactoring book, you can find some articles on the web. If you're having trouble, you just remember that, you know, there are three nano steps that you can always take, or micro steps, I guess, that you can always take that are a good idea. Write a test, remove duplication, improve names. That's it. You don't need to know anymore. Everything else, all the other design principles that you rely on, solid, coupling and cohesion, any of that stuff, you can get there by chunking. If you just start with write a test, remove duplication, improve names. That's the book I wish I'd written. And maybe I will end up writing at some point.
I hope you do write it.
I kind of hope I do write it too. I think eventually I'm going to have to. I think that stuff is coming out whether I want it to or not. I have a sneaking suspicion that the next training course that I build will essentially be the proving ground, and the end result of that training course will end up being that book. I just don't know if I will. And maybe in the meantime, somebody will beat me to it, which I certainly don't mind. I would rather have the book than write the book, but I'll write the book if that's what it takes to have the book. Let's see here. I'm just reading through the comments and questions here. Yes, Jonathan Donald points out about that, you know, obviously chunking has nothing to do with software development. It has everything to do with how we build skill. So if you're interested in skill development as a general concept, If, for example, like me, you are a professional athlete, I'm going to call 5-pin bowler a professional athlete. I'm going to stretch the terms professional and athlete as far as I possibly can. If you coach, and especially if you coach kids, like I do, that books like Talent is Overrated and The Talent Code are good entry points into the power of deliberate practice, the power of chunking, a little bit of the just enough neuroscience to be dangerous, but with the idea of helping people understand I mean, on the one hand, you can think of it as how to practice effectively. And on the other hand, you can think of it as how to take advantage of the work that you do and to turn more of it into something closer to deliberate practice, right? One weird thing about software development, especially for programmers in particular, is we're a group of people who have convinced ourselves that we are always performing and we're never rehearsing, that we're always playing the game and never practicing. And I never understood that. The best writers edit their work. The best music composers edit their compositions. They refine. They do the equivalent of refactoring. They do the equivalent of evolutionary design in their work. They tend to produce great works through successive refinement. Why the hell do programmers think that they're an exception? I don't get it. I don't understand. And granted, it's not always programmers who have this idea. Why do project managers think that programmers don't need to edit, don't need to rehearse? Why do product managers think this? If we're going to be in that situation, so we're probably not going to change the culture of project managers, product managers, line managers in the next 8 minutes. But what we can do is take advantage of the slack that we have to create space to practice deliberately in a way that allows us to compound our slack so that eventually we can reach the point where the bottleneck is no longer us, but them, where they can't think of stuff for us to build fast enough, where they can't think of stuff to change fast enough, right? That's the lesson from extreme programming, right? That one of the goals of extreme programming is to move the bottleneck out of programming to some other part of the software development machine, whether that's exploring features or releasing or whatever it is, any other feedback loop. We can start by taking advantage of the fact that people keep instructing us to write code. Well, we can use every time we sit down to write code as an opportunity to do some deliberate practice, even if it's only 30 minutes at the end of every 3-day task, even if it's only 30 minutes once a week, Friday afternoons. That much of practice is better than none. And if you need several thousand hours of deliberate practice, then the best time to start was 20 years ago, and the second best time to start is now. Let's see. So yes, if you don't like nano commits in your commit log, then it's always easier to squash commits than it is to split them apart. So I have a bias towards smaller commits because squashing is easier than splitting. Let's see here. Llewellyn Falco promotes commits at non-level together with classifying risk. Interesting. Yeah, my commit comments tend to focus more on progress through the task. So I tend to write, we can now do blah, 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 but only in situation, blah, blah, blah. And that sort of, but only in situation is a reminder of what needs to be done left. Or I've also started writing sometimes, we can now, this module can now do blah, 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 but I'm not happy with the way I've written it. as a reminder to clean up before moving on. Again, it's easier to delete information or ignore it than it is to reverse engineer it. So putting extra details into your commit comments almost always hurts less than people think it will. Let's see here. Yes, so Daniel Ranner asked about sort of how do I need this test scale to, do we as a team need this test? So one simple strategy is to stick with the lowest common denominator, is just to say that, you know, we choose to be as cautious as the most cautious of us needs to be. We choose to be only as confident as the least confident of us is willing to be. And then that person's confidence level becomes a bottleneck, and we try to do something to help with that. Ensemble programming, pair programming, training, whatever it is, you know, put them on the most urgent tasks with somebody who's there to help them so that they can, you know, take advantage of the promiscuous pairing beginner's mind effect from Arlo Belchi's talk, his paper, least qualified implementer. If the least qualified implementer always takes the lead on a task, then that accelerates learning about as fast as we possibly can. Another thing to do is to use an extremely advanced technique. It's actually it's a very rare controversial technique. It's so advanced that I'm not even sure I want to share it with you. It's called talking to each other. And the idea is to openly talk about our confidence levels in our practices, to openly talk about how comfortable we are with the way we work. And so there's a way that you can do that that helps break the ice in environments where maybe trust is a bit lower, but it also works well in high trust environments. I play a game called What's Not to Like About This Code. As far as I'm aware, I invented this game in its current form, so I'll take credit for it for now. The idea of what's not to like about this code is you gather people together, you put some code on the wall or on the screen. Maybe for your first session, you don't use your code, pick somebody else's code, somebody who's not in the room. And somebody facilitates. So the facilitator points to the code, points to the group, and asks, what's not to like about this code, and waits for an answer. And the question is very important because invariably a programmer will point to something and say, I would call that, and then provide a better name, or I'd extract this to a little function. And the facilitator at that moment would say, that's a wonderful suggestion. I think that's fantastic. That's not the question I asked you. The question I asked you is, what's not to like about this code? Therefore, what is it about this code that made you want to do that thing, that triggered that suggestion, that made you suggest that? And what you're trying to do, gently but firmly, is to guide the programmer to articulate the problem, to articulate the symptom, to articulate what they see. And you practice this over and over again. So as a facilitator, my job is essentially to write down things that we don't like, to keep asking the question, what's not to like about this code, to maybe let two people argue about it a little bit. Someone might say, I don't like this. And the other person will say, well, in general, I don't like that. But in this situation, it doesn't bother me because blah, 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 blah. Or, wow, you're really worried about that? Why are you worried? You know, show me on the doll where somebody hurt you in your past. Like, why is it that this bothers you so much? Because that doesn't bother me at all. And gently guide people to answering the question, what's not to like about this code? The objective of this game is not to refactor the code. It's not to do a code review. It's not to have a to-do list of ways to improve the code, because this to-do list will go into the backlog and nobody will ever do it. And it'll just make everybody feel bad about the 1,318 tasks that we'll never get to. That's not the goal. As far as I can tell, the main goals are to encourage people to practice articulating what they don't like, to separate fact from opinion, to be aware when they are advocating for something that they feel is objectively better compared to merely asserting their preference. their awareness of when things are better or worse in a certain context, to articulate exceptions to general rules where we agree to follow the general rule, but we allow these kinds of exceptions. What we're doing is not only being more aware of what we are saying, but also developing a shared understanding and a shared working standard. Shared understanding of what we care about, what we notice, what we attend to, what we try to fix and what we don't try to fix, so that if you and I are pairing and I take a step and you want me to take a smaller step, we don't have to fight about that every time. We don't have to relitigate whether it's a good idea. I'm not going to argue in favor of my way. You're not going to argue in favor of your way. And I don't always feel like I have to silently apply the lowest common denominator principle, but instead we can negotiate that openly and say, yeah, you know what? I agree with you. This is a problem in general, but this is a problem only because we don't adopt that practice. Now I think we can all agree that if we don't adopt that practice, this problem is going to continue to be a bottleneck. That can help us move forward instead of us playing tug of war and pull requests, yelling at each other, getting frustrated with each other during pair programming or ensemble programming sessions. If we openly negotiate what we care about, what bothers us, if we are more aware of when something is bad for the group or just bad for us, we are more likely to resolve those conflicts with less bloodshed, with more harmony, more easily, with less stress. And then questions of, should I take this big step or would it be better for the group if I took a smaller step, will be clearer in our mind. And in the worst case, somebody has to point out to me, hey, those big steps hurt us. And instead of me sitting there going, you people need to just move faster, this is ridiculous, high tide lifts all boats, blah, 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 blah. We can sit down and play what's not to like about this code for an hour, get it all out on the table, and come to a bit of a resolution. And over time, we converge towards common standards where more often we just do what feels comfortable for the group rather than trying to manage all this. So that's what I meant by talking to each other about it. I think that that helps us scale up. Do I need these tests? Do we need these tests? Who needs these tests? And occasionally, you know, evolutionary design without tests Friday afternoon for an hour, you know, once every 2 weeks is probably not a bad idea, because neither should we allow our habits, the habits of the past, become the blind spots of today. It's not a bad idea every so often to take something that was a security blanket a year ago and try to live without it for a while just to see what would happen. You might learn something. All right, I know that we're at the end of time. So yeah, I pointed to the right direction this time. So you can always go here and ask questions. As I said earlier, if you ask a question and you're willing to wait indefinitely for the answer, then that service is free. If you reach a point where you need a better service level agreement than I can provide, then we can talk about how much that costs. It's less expensive than you might think. I'm doing ensemble programming sessions with PubMob. I also do all kinds of training and stuff. So if you think that you need some private help for you, your team, your group, your company, you know where to find me. And I got nothing but time. So I would enjoy getting a chance to talk to you about what you might need. And especially if you think I'm insane, if you think I'm out to lunch, if this all sounded like craziness to you, then please don't be afraid to go here and tell me. I'd like an opportunity to understand what I might be missing so that I will embarrass myself less the next time I do this.
Very nice. JB, thank you for modeling this radical idea of talking to each other, including the part about negotiating at the end. Practicing what you preach, as always. It was wonderful. I really love the Q&A and how that worked out, especially the part where you predicted the future questions at least 3 times and answered them before seeing them. Fantastic. I got to learn how that works. This video will be up on YouTube probably about 12 hours from now. And the next speaker will be announced shortly. And thank you all for coming from wherever you're here from. And we'll see you next month. Thanks again, JB.